Ph.D. dissertation deals with the poetry of prominent Israeli poet Aaron Shabtai as a unique meeting point between the classical Greek world, Judaic ancient text, and modern poetry. And Ronen participated as a fellow in the Human Rights and Judaism program at the Israeli Democracy Institute. So we're having this second session. So this is the second part of a two-part session about the book, Israeli Culture and Emergency Routine, Normalizing Stress. And before we start, I just want to note a couple of things that I think are important before we start. This book was not written as a response to October 7th and the ensuing war. We started working on this project in 2018 when we were working at Sapir College, and we got together as colleagues, as scholars, under attack of another quote-unquote round of rocket attack. So the book was, it took about 5 years to write the book, but the final edits were due on October 5th, 2023. And we were just able to insert a dedication. And I want, before we start, to read the dedication. This book is dedicated to all people impacted by the October 2023 attack, including our friends and loved ones who contributed to the making of the book. We hope for the end of the cycle of violence and for a better future. So the book, Israeli Culture and Emergency Routine, exposes the way Israeli quote-unquote emergency routine leads to perpetual stress and trauma, and the book explores how these conditions are overwhelmingly present in the cultural production of Israeli art and literature. So what we do in the book is we show that stress and trauma are represented across the board in Israeli literature and art, and we show also the diversity of this production. The 9 chapters engage with a variety of Israeli cultural artifacts, including poetry, prose, cinema, and graphic novels. We cast a wide temporal net reaching as far as the 1960s all the way to 2019. In doing so, the collection sheds light upon the ramifications of the constant stress of Israeli emergency routine on academic and cultural discourses. I will already introduce our, I'll actually introduce Professor Gertz and Professor Herzog. I'll go ahead and introduce Professor Herzog and Professor Gertz, who are joining us via Zoom. Professor Nurith Gertz is a Professor Emerita of Hebrew Literature and Film at the Open University of Israel and a full professor at the Department of Cultural Studies at Sapir Academic College. At the Tel Aviv University, she headed the Cinema Studies program of the Department of Film and Television, as well as the MA program of Cinema Studies. She founded and headed the Department of Cultural Studies at Sapir Academic College, as well as the MA program of Cultural Studies at the Open University of Israel. Currently, she serves as the head of Sapir Academic College's MA program of Cultural Studies, which she also founded. As a visiting scholar, she taught at UC Berkeley, Yale University, University of Paris and Brandeis University. Gertz won the Dov Sedan Award for Outstanding Research in Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, the Brenner Prize for Literature in 2009 for her book Unrepented, which was also shortlisted for the Sapir Prize for Literature. And the Levi Eshkol Hebrew Writers Prize in 2021 for her book, What Was Lost to Time. Among her recent books are An Ocean Between Us, published in 2015, Traces of Days to Come, Trauma and Ethics in Contemporary Israeli Cinema, published in 2017, and What Was Lost to Time, published in 2020. Omri Herzog is a professor of cultural studies. His recent articles deal with corporal politics, emotional utopias, and the study of contemporary Israeli culture. His latest book, Compliance and Resistance Within Neoliberal Academia, was published with Palgrave in 2021. He is a literary critic for Haaretz newspaper, for which he won the Bernstein Prize. It is my great pleasure and privilege to invite my colleagues here to share our discussion with you today.
Actually, we are quite used to talking Zoom. Our college, Nurith and I, both teach at Sapir College. You probably hear that in the Gaza envelope. And the college was shut down after the terror attack and the war. So we are having the semester via Zoom. So we are no stranger to such difficulties. But anyway, thank you for joining us, and let's start, because what we would like to do is just to present our paper and our thinking about literature in times of chaos. So we will present briefly, not briefly, but somehow briefly, we'll present our paper, and then we may just discuss the current chaotic event, and we'll discuss it together, if you are still there, because we have no way to know that. Okay, so let's start. We wrote this article like 3 years ago, Nurith, right? And we named it because we like the name Literature in the Time of Chaos, and we perceived ourselves as being in a time of total chaos. It was 3 years ago, and little did we know, right? Talking about it now. But let's go back 3 years ago, and then we'll jump back to nowadays. When we have the title, Literature in the Time of Chaos, but we needed to understand what chaos is, right? And unfortunately, we were directed to physics, the one subject that I failed miserably in my final exam in high school, and I know nothing about physics. And Nurith, I think, knows even less than I do, right? Okay. So, but we had no choice but to read some articles and talk with physicians to understand the physical terms of chaos. And what we understood is, so that's a general knowledge for you. Chaos describes a system in which if we change a certain parameter, we may fail to predict its possible transformations. So basically, chaos it describes a situation where that transcends human perceptions of prediction and meaning. Okay, so luckily enough, Jean Baudrillard uses the terms as well, and he uses a chaos theory, which he describes as the tendency of cultural system to divide rapidly while producing a fast transition from stability to instability. So when questions of truth, validation, and reality are sidelined for the sake of the random creation of realities and ideologies from the codes of mass media, that's where chaos occur. So with no organizing principle, ad hoc ideologies rely on arbitrary collection from the overwhelming supply of media and technological abundance. So the concept of reality loses its linear principle, as well as its ability to decode it or to predict its future using causal relations. From the overflow saturated signifier retrieved from history, myth, popular culture, or just imagination, it renounces the authority of any mega theory, and thus also the ability to choose between contradictory acts of signifying that occurred within it. Okay, so that's a somehow complicated explanation to what we experience, right? In the States, in a different way in here. And we wanted to use this concept to look at contemporary Israeli society, which has been plagued with the imminent dispute over concepts like citizenship, truth, law, and governance, which are assailed by constant undermining and doubt. Now, doubt is not immanent in the intrinsic definition of attitudes within the local culture. Rather, public discourse is rooted in the absolute truth and stable knowledge structures which assume a network of binary dichotomies like I, other, right, wrong, friend, enemy, who belong and who doesn't belong. So, and although each knowledge structure is consistent in itself and governed by the absolute certainty of its internal justification, juxtaposing it with a parallel knowledge structure produce profound contradictions. And in that cultural architecture, the state of chaos is rooted. Now, the question is, what is literature roles in the time of chaos, and what are its modes of operation and interpretation? We both, Nurith and I, are literary critics. Nurith writes in the newspaper, and she has a segment in a very popular radio show where she recommends books, and I also write in the newspaper literary critiques. So we read a lot of novels, Israeli novels, especially debut novels, and we could sense that, the literature in Israel now uses some strategies which express the chaotic situation's diffusion into literary works, both consciously and unconsciously, and traces of chaos are found in those works and even activate them. And we came about two major strategies in which you can find chaos inside literature. And I invite Nurith to introduce us with the first one.
The first one and the difficult one. Yours is much easier. Are you sure we want to start? Okay, I give up. So, I'd like to discuss a narrative that fails to take control of its characters, build a plot that will render them distinct and judge them, or organize them in a coherent causal order. We just heard about chaos, so this is a kind of chaos. No rules. Yet it can be defined as the opposite. It is a narrative that manages to locate and map the chaos and violence in a reality where our anarchy reigns and good and evil are indistinguishable. One could say that this narrative managed to reflect this reality so accurately that the reader loses himself among the pages, unable to master the tangle of events, unable to tell who is guilty and who is innocent, or grasp the character motives. Nothing, completely disorder. But it does not only destroy a particular genre, it casts doubts on the very possibility of telling a story. It adopts a cultural reality in which it is unclear what is truth and what is false, what are facts and what is fantasy. Everything said today can change tomorrow, and there is no happy ending or utopian vision to guide the way. I hope you are familiar with kind of this literature. It's not very popular, but it had a straight influence on culture. In his article, Contingency, Causality, Complexity, Thomas Elsasser describes films that require viewers to change their perceptions of reality while watching, to create false hypotheses and to change the concepts of time and space from one moment to the next. According to him, those films depict an apparently realistic world, but are structured along parallel lines with competing worlds and constantly shifting vantage points, with no fixed perspective or hierarchical organization. That description provides the background for understanding several recently written books. And I'll speak about Israeli Hebrew books. Those books observe a chaotic network of arbitrary facts, paradoxes, and contradictions, and refuse to turn it into a story whose linear progression enables a single moral or historical truth to take shape. No truth, no direction, at least not one. There are many, so no root and no direction. That is, with good and bad, causes and consequences, a beginning, middle, and end. Everything is destroyed here. No beginning, middle, and end, nothing. They abandon the possibility of organizing reality so it can be understood, controlled, and acted on, presenting options rather than solutions, differences without a common denominator, and movement between fluid phenomena. In his latest book, The Last Interview, Eshkol Nevo, the novelist, doesn't attempt to describe the reality of chaos. A priori, he seeks to shelter this shelter of fiction, but it is a shaky refuge because it's unclear which of its components is false or true, what is grounded on solid facts, and which arguments are false within the narrative he creates. The narrator is allegedly the biographical writer, Eshkol Nevo himself, and many familiar details indicate this. But it's hard to know what is biographical in his novel and what is invented. Ostensibly, it's a document. It consists of a collection of answers to a standard journalist questionnaire that every author receives now and then. Omri and me, we know something about it. But the seemingly autobiographical answers turn into invented story. At a conference abroad, the writer has a fling with a journalist who interviews him. And when he returns home, he tells his wife, which appends their marriage. It seems to be a true account, but later the writer admits to his wife that he invented the story to get her attention. So what's true, what's not true? Not clear. Evidence of the couple's troubled marriage recurs throughout the book and seems credible, but the credibility transpires to be questionable. The evidence is repeatedly presented as a story invented by the writer, who doesn't distinguish between truth and literature. Answering a question, he imagines the story that his son will write about his parents' marriage when he grows up. Since that marriage story has already been related in previous chapters as autobiographical, and the narrator is identified throughout the book with the author, and because he convincingly adopts the child's observation of his parents' unraveling marriage, the still unwritten story, which probably will never be written, seems a reliable biographical scenario. But can a story describing something that will happen in the imagined future be a credible record of a true past? No. In other cases, too, the book does not describe what happened or what existed only in the imagination, but what might have happened. The author answers a question. This is the answer. Suppose I was writing about another planet, and suppose there was an underground movement there, and suppose the authorities of that planet were pursuing that underground, and suppose that the underground was discovered. What's the difference? Anyway, the result would be that yet again I was writing about an impossible love. This story isn't a story. It's just an answer to a journalist's question that relates not to what happened, but to what we suppose happened. And yet, that answer is tangibly interpreted and linked to the biography of the narrator, author, to the extent that it's not at all clear what is unfounded in this passage and what is real, what is invention, what is reality. The last interview, this book, casts doubt on what is related in the book, acknowledging that reality cannot be arranged, sorted, or organized. Its author chooses to blur the boundaries between it and the discussion and to cross the dividing line between document and fiction. The failure of documentation of the last interview is the success of the novel with the same title, because this is the theme of the story. Another book, Oriane Morris' novel, Spying Under Another Place, also has no story and no frame. Chaos reigns. Events burst their banks, are unlinked to a continuous plot, sometimes split between different narrators, sometimes questionable and sometimes contradictory. At certain moments, the writer asks for his reader to help him ending the story however he wants. He admits he has no story, just a collection of details that are not properly interwoven. And he asks the reader to continue it, to end it for him. The stories he includes mostly attest to the impossibility of telling a story. The book opens with a first-person confession. The narrator has received a manuscript by a suicidal person. He reads and corrects it, and at the same time integrates his own life story into it. The reader can't tell who is living in the narrated reality, who is observing it from afar, who found the manuscript and edited it, or who wrote it. Nothing is clear here. The identities blend into each other and into other identities in the book. A writer of detective novels hears the stories told by a beggar on a Mendele street in Tel Aviv and by an Ethiopian boy, mixed up with the story of a murder, which seems motiveless. A story interact into another story, enter into another story, nothing is clear. Someone decides that he wants to announce his death while he's still living and goes to Social Security to delete himself from the records, to stop his insurance payment. So that's how we will understand he's dead, but he's alive. The mother of the manuscript's author writes him a letter threatening that if the book is published, she will sever her relationship with him. The manuscript of the book we read now. A rejection letter from the book's publisher states that the book which we are reading is immature, unfit for publication, but still we are reading it. So it is indeed a book that has given up. Instead of telling a story, it tells everything that can't be put in it. It refuses to be imprisoned in a single fictional sequence and abandons the range of possibilities that were left out, those that were unfulfilled and never will be. Chaos, then, is not the novel's problem, but its theme. A gaze at realities whose contradictions and paradoxes cannot be resolved through a clear and orderly story in a correct linear causal sequence. This is the end of the non-fiction, non-paper.
Okay, so that was like the more complicated part, like the more complicated strategy that we noticed. And I will briefly present the second one, which is more like derived from some easy reading novels, a bit more. And we titled it the second strategy. We titled it "No Place Like Home," which is kind of yeah, okay. So the second common strategy confronts chaos by withdrawing. That's kind of predictable, withdrawing into the domestic sphere. In this model, the dividing wall between the undermined national home and the private home is reflected psychologically in the face of the anxiety and helplessness that external chaos creates. The home is considered the only defined space where authority can be asserted and meaning reconstructed. A literary protagonist can withstand the dangers threatening their homes and families, and through rational self-control can block the subverting chaos that threatens to penetrate the households without having to engage with it or to resolve it. I'm reading lots of books, and I've noticed that as if impelled by some sort of cultural compulsion, more than like quite a few books repeat the same story, just the same story. And the plot line of those in general is quite identical. So they present a middle-aged career woman in a stable marriage, in quite a happy marriage, and she starts a risky affair with a man from her past who unexpectedly comes back to her life. After some kind of deliberation and dilemmas, she decided to end the subversive secret relationship and to barricade her home against this threat he represents. So the central conflict in these stories is the temptation of the unknown, which emerges from the chaos outside and tries to drag its protagonist out there, away from her family and from her home. Choosing the familiar is an intellectual choice made by the main character, not an emotional one. It comes at a price that involves abandoning emotional, sexual, and sometimes political and intellectual activity, preferring the passivity of preserving the status quo. Now, such a storyline, to put it gently, isn't particularly original in modern popular literature, but the fact that it is so prevalent in contemporary Israeli literature cannot be grounded solely on the universality of such conflict. Its frequent revival on the contemporary Israeli bookshelf is significant, and it evidences the cultural and even political strategy of facing chaos. Now, the model of chaos in these novels involved two coexisting ideological structures, both of which draw inspiration and justification from contemporary culture, while each has its own truth and absolute cultural legitimacy. They're completely antithetical. On the one hand, the capitalist claim for self-realization, which includes satisfying emotional and sexual needs, autonomy, self-awareness, the aspiration for self-improvement, and on the other hand, commitment to the family unit as a nation's basic unit, which comprises sacrifice, compromise, restraints, and delaying immediate gratification. Now, dealing with both structures and the ideologies that drive them rules out mutual mediation. No story offers, not one of the novels offers some kind of compromise or negotiation, such as, for example, simultaneously enjoying the domestic harmony and an electrifying affair. The decision made by the protagonist is dichotomous and is urgently needed because the movement between contradictory knowledge structure send the protagonist into a spin that totally undermines the self. They must make one choice and one choice only: safeguarding the nuclear family while sacrificing private desires, opting for the traditional national basic unit, and secluding themselves in the domestic sphere, which bars the entry to external conflicts. Now, the significance of this strategy can be elucidated through the characterization of the protagonist encounter with this handsome, subversive, untamed outside. Okay, the man comes to their life. The inherent threat of that encounter has two layers. The first is rooted in the diffusion of the erotic element into the family life. Okay. The second layer undermines and complicates it because the man who appears from the outside signifies not only the dangerous, exciting option for the protagonist's sexual or emotional fulfillment, but for he himself, in his biographical context, represent the broad notion of chaos. In all of these novels, the male stranger, the lover, has an inherent unresolved ideological and national contradiction. In this sense, the novels don't rely on the simple dichotomy of the romantic novel, centering around the choice between the right man and the wrong man. Actually, the husbands, like in the novels, are hardly mentioned, and they're drawn as very flat characters and play marginal role in a plot. The main conflict doesn't concern the choice between the husband and the lover from the past, but they withdraw from the chaos signified by the man's appearances, accompanied by his symbolic baggage. Those novels expose an ideological conflict which the heroine confronted in her past and now threatens to undermine her life again. And to be more exact, encountering the men who reappear in her life signified not only the threat to the woman's status as a mother and a wife, but also a symbolic threat to the nation. Each man represents an aspect of a painful, unresolved national conflict, which is subverting and subverted. For example, the man in a novel called I Have Two Hearts signifies the protagonist's option to uproot herself, to move away from Israel to the UK and seek happiness and success outside Israel. In another novel, Stolen Son, the man represents another kind of subversion linked to the sexual assault of a female combat soldier and the wound that opened up in the divide between the local militaristic ethos and its cost for women. And the man who reappears in the life of the female protagonist of the third novel, which is called Pain, signifies a disruption of one's trajectory through the terrorist attack in Jerusalem in the past, and its symbolic responsibility for the physical and mental pain that's now integral in the protagonist's life. So each man, these are just three examples, each man represents two distinct sets of knowledge which coexist in Israel public discourse and are in profound contradiction, embodied not only in the man's erotic image and its implicit threat to the heroine's emotional and familial status, but also in the way that each man represents a moment of national ideological chaos. The first man's story juxtaposes a capitalist claim for self-fulfillment across national borders with a notion of leaving Israel as a betrayal of a local national ethos, an irresponsible choice that places personal interests over the more urgent national loyalty. The second one, who is a combat medic, set in opposition the promoting of gendered partnership in the militaristic ethos, which underpins Israeli nationalism, with the inherent chauvinism of that ethos. And the third man, who heads the pain clinic, which works with the victim of terrorism, relates to the national ethos of sacrifice as and the concept of existence in the spirit of the phrase spoken in Passover ritual in Jewish families. In every generation, they rise up against us and try to destroy us. And this is constructed with the aspiration for a pain-free life and the normalization of a nation, hoping to remove from the body every trace of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, or to deny its existence. All the women protagonists in those novels, now mature women, decide to reject that threat or that complexity, not to re-engage with it or to face up to it, but to close themselves off in their homes. All those novels conclude with the same happy end. The women are back in their family's secure embrace and come to terms with the exclusion of the chaotic figure, as well as the ideological conflict that the man, the lover, once signified for them. So secluding oneself in the family and in the domestic sphere and turning away from destructive chaos are accompanied in those three novels I mentioned by similar sensation. And that's interesting, I think. And this sensation, by the end of the book, the protagonist, the woman, describe her resilience to pain and somehow some kind of facilitation and numbness. At the very end of one of the novels I mentioned, it is called I Have Two Hearts, the narrator testifies to the protagonist's consciousness, and I quote, "Just rubbing the skin above her heel, it's nothing. When people targeting a major goal, they don't feel such pain. She cannot feel it either. Withdrawing into the private home, ignoring the hazards of the national chaos outside, create a passive attitude of physical and emotional denial of the side outside, turning one's back on the harrowing conflicts he spoke of. Similarly, in the final lines of another novel, the protagonists think, and that's a quote, "Pain is an excuse. It screens real life, which demands 100% vigilance. So enough." So in these novels, the movement of withdrawing inwards prevents the pain associated with awareness of chaos, rendering it irrelevant. Chaos rages outside, but the literature of this model can only be written in detachment from it, repressing its physical, emotional, and ideological aspects. It's nothing more than a slight pain, just an old story that will heal in the fortified confines of the private home. And I think it's not just escapism, pure escapism, but a rational choice to sacrifice in order to look away, to pay the price so I can look away from the ethical and from the political chaos, and also from potential change. So these were the two strategies that we noticed, that we seen in Israeli literature 3 years ago. Since I can't hear you, and maybe it's time for if you have some questions or comments, or we can discuss what's happened now in literature, whatever interests you.
Are there any questions? So perhaps we might open it up to broader questions, questions to Professor Herzog and Professor Gertz, but also questions to Irit, Avner, and myself. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
A bit of theoretical background. So Israeli state was established in 1948, and since then it was in a legal status of state of emergency. That is a quote from the Israeli parliament site, the Knesset. I was gonna go through some of the causes of the tension and trauma and PTSD in Israeli culture, like wars, military operations. You can hear me well, right? And other terrorist attack, traumatic events, and other that made the Israeli nation a traumatized nation. But I'm gonna run real quick. Okay, that's a film. That's a real life video of a siren. Whenever a bomb rocket is gonna hit Israeli territory, a red alert goes on and tells everyone to go into shelter. So if you're in a bus stop and you have no place to run to, they make this like nice shelter place in bus stations. I put it on in order to show you how stress is part of normal life in Israel. They try to make it nice, but it is still very horrible. Okay, that's children in shelters in 1967, the 6 Days War. That's in the 90s, the Gulf War, which Israel was under a threat of biological and chemical bombs from Iraq. Okay, this is the Gaza Strip. You can see Sderot. That's the place where three of us met for the first time because we taught and conducted research there. what is state of emergency, theoretically? So Carl Schmitt, German philosopher, told us that the sovereign is defined because he is the one who is declaring the state of emergency or the state of exception. That's like the same word in German language.
Walter Benjamin, who preceded this concept, told us, and I'll read it, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live in is not the exception, but the rule. We must attain a conception of history that accords with this insight. Then we will clearly see that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. Okay, it was written in the beginning of Nazi regime. Okay, so what's so problematic with state of emergency? Why is it a problem? It gives the sovereign the opportunity and the privilege to be above the law. Under the protection of state of emergency, the sovereign can do a lot of things, like reducing the power of the legal system, deprivation of civil rights. Those are things we can see in Israel everyday life, and more strongly in the last year with the juridical revolution or reform, as it is called in Israel. Okay, I brought some of the artistic and literary representation to give you a sense of how does the state of emergency influence the culture that is being produced in Israel. So this is a very iconic anti-war sculpture by a very famous Israeli artist, Yigal Tumarki. This was made after 1967, when Israel was in euphoria because winning against Arabic armies, surrounding it and trying to attack it. So you can see the soldier, the pilot, is arrogant and defaced. In our book, we have an article by Ilaria Stiller-Timor, which demonstrates how Israeli comics, novel artists, Ruth Modan and Gilad Salikter, respond to the state of emergency. A plane crashes in the territory of the village of the kibbutz, and they say, "Oh, it's not our galley, it's not our guy, so not too bad." They develop indifference. They're indifferent to other people's death because they see so much of it. This is another group called Tnu'a Tziburit, public movement. Those are people with navy uniforms that are mysteriously dead. When this is the beach of Tel Aviv. When you first look at it, you think there are surfboards and they're going to surf in the beach. But when you look closer, you can see there are sketchers that carry wounded and the dead. So this is a good example of Israeli art dealing with the state of emergency and seeing how is it a part of life and how is the traumatic and continuous stress is part of daily life. Okay. עוד שתי דקות? Okay. This is author Aharon Shabtai, which is the greatest Israeli translator from ancient Greek to Hebrew. the Homeric epos and many Greek drama. All of them he translated. And this is a poem, a small poem called Exodus. So you can see here the Hebrew and the translation. Oh, it moved. Okay. I will not read it, you can read it. But you can see it opens with a siren. The moment of birth is the moment of emergency. And the narrator is a baby which is taken to the shelter when he's only a small baby, and he's put in an ark. Who else was put in an ark? Moses. From the moment this baby is born, this narrator, which is also consistent with Shabbatai's biography, he was born in a time of crisis, and he was 9 years old when the War of Independence erupted. They put on his shoulders the load of being a leader and saving the Israeli people, like they did with Moses. And this is it's very representative. Like every small child born in Israel has this weight, has this load on his shoulders. I think I leave you with that. Vered can distribute the presentation.
At the beginning, while you gather your thoughts, at the beginning of the event yesterday, I commenced by offering a broad trigger warning, saying this book is about trauma, it's about war, it's about post-traumatic stress disorder, it's about continuous stress. And I think because of all the technical hiccups, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. But it is, the book, as Irit said, it is about representations of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and continuous stress in Israeli culture.
Hi, everybody. Since we have so little time, I would skip all the theory, the ideas I wanted to present today about my chapter. But I think maybe it would be interesting for you to hear a few words, which I also described yesterday in our session yesterday, a few words about what happened in the 7th of October for us as a personal experience, and maybe that would be important and interesting for you. As Irit mentioned and also Vered mentioned earlier, I'm a resident of Sderot, which is right here. So you see the Gaza Strip here, the rest of Israel, and that's 2 kilometers. My house is 2 kilometers from the fence. And this fence was fully established in 2019. And from then on, we had a very strong belief that it's a very strong fence. There's a lot of efforts put in that fence, and unfortunately, as probably most of you know, on the 7th of October, a small organization with not many resources destroyed this fence completely and started this horrible war that we're in. Me and my family at that day, we were maybe just 2 days before that, we were on a bike trip, me and my family, and my son broke his leg and with a bike, and because he had a broken leg, he was not able to do what he is very accustomed to do, which is running to shelter. The last 20 years, from 2001 until today, so more than 20 years, we are suffering from attacks of rockets. Sometimes it is once a day, sometimes it's once a month, sometimes it's a few in more than a month. So it changes a lot, and this book. Just look at the title of our book. Not the first one, the first line, but the second line: emergency routine. How can you take the state of emergency, what Irit was speaking about a few minutes ago, and make it into a routine, something that you do every day, just running into shelter? Now, as I said earlier, my son, he's 13 years old, broke his leg, so he could not run to shelter. So in this war, his emotional, psychological status was much worse than the usual because you cannot run. You're totally vulnerable to the rockets. On the 7th of October, we woke up to a different reality, different from what we experienced the last 20 years. And the difference is that it's just the amount. The amount of rockets was huge. And soon enough afterwards, we realized that this is not only rockets, but it is also Hamas units inside our town and killing people, murdering people. And we realized that we have to do something different than what we usually do. We went into the safe room that we have in our house, and we had to stay there for 30 hours, 4 people in that small room. We were giving ourselves the opportunity to, we were saying, okay, it's okay to go to the restroom and go to the refrigerator for just 1 minute, go out and get back again. When I'm thinking about that in retrospective, I would say that was also reckless. That was not safe enough to do these things, but we did. So we were able to stay in that situation. And after these 30 hours, we got the message that we can go out. It was not completely safe, but safe enough to run to our car and get out of town as fast as possible. And since then until this minute now, we cannot go back to our home. We cannot stay in our home. And you can try to imagine, what does it mean to be chased out of your home, not able to go there for 6 months. And also, if you can imagine, 30 hours in this kind of situation, in this safe room. I wanted to just to give you some kind of hint of what kind of feeling it is, but because I have no time, I might just conclude with one short observation, and that is that when I tell my students about what happened to me, about being chased out of my house, of being a refugee in my own state, in my own country. When I tell them about that, I sometimes, in one of the classes, I said that it's not only me, it's another 2 million people who are suffering the same situation, being chased out of your house, and not able to go back, and many people who died. And my students, Israeli students, young people, not very different from you guys, were asking me, why are you speaking about 2 million? The Israelis who are not in their home are much less. It's 300,000 more or less people from the north of Israel and from the area around the Gaza envelope, around the Gaza Strip. It's only 300,000. And I soon realized that these students are absolutely unable, or it's very hard for them at least, to actually listen to other people suffering during war. Because when I'm talking about 2 million, I'm referring to the Israelis who are out of their houses and cannot go back, and the people from in Gaza that are out of their house and cannot go back. And if you think about these two populations, two communities in Gaza and the Gaza envelope, there's actually quite a lot of similarities. These are two communities who were neglected and betrayed by their government. Hamas betrayed the people of Gaza, causing or affecting this war, and the consequences are huge. And the Israeli government betrayed the people of Gaza envelope. The army was supposed to be there. The army was supposed to protect these people. It was supposed to enable me to go back to my home. It does not do that. And the war that is supposedly should be like a solution to the problem. It's not a solution to the problem. It's worsening the problem. So there are two brutal attacks, one by the state of Israel and one by a terrorist organization. The two of them are brutal. And the two of them are towards people who were betrayed by their own government, betrayed by their own leaders. And I think that's the similarity that is very hard for Israelis to grasp, very hard for Gazans to grasp. But maybe if other people in other countries who really understand that there's something so wrong here in people living in this kind of emergency routine. I mean, I know it's hard for you to imagine that. But maybe this kind of understanding that we are trying to promote in this book can contribute something, not much, something to a change for the church.
Thank you. So we literally have just a few minutes left. I would just like to add a couple of points. While there might be similarities, there's a clear asymmetry. As you articulated, one is a nation state, and the other is a terrorist organization. One of the things that we, I think, as Avner said, would like to convey is what I always jokingly say is a paradox. We are Israeli optimists. We still hope that people will bridge over these gaps with empathy and compassion and reach agreement rather than war. We will continue this conversation surely in our discussions, and with your permission, this is an extended invitation for conversation. Virtually via emails, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions and to continue the conversation. With that, since we are, I'm afraid, out of time, I would like to thank you all very much for coming today. Thank our hosts, of course, and thank Irit and Avner for coming. Please join me in thanking them.
And also I think I will also speak from the staff of Irit, on behalf of Irit, that coming here and being able to present what we wrote is something really strong for us, especially in our situation. And I really am very thankful for the generosity of the university and the initiative to have this session. So I thank you very, very much.
Especially Professor Ronen and Professor Weiss for inviting us, and for you for listening and paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you.